What is up, guys? Eric Thane here from Cinema Mastery, and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be talking about 5 things that cinematographers do that makes their work look so cinematic that videographers maybe miss sometimes. Let's jump into it. So when we're talking about cinematography versus videography, obviously there's, it's all up for debate. It's this terminology, cinematographer versus videographer. People have their different perspectives on it. It's really just semantics, their definitions, it's vocabulary. The way that I like to put it is that a videographer captures the world as it is. A cinematographer creates a world. And so if you can create work that looks more cinematic, it will actually do better for you as far as like drawing more attention to your work, as far as getting higher paid clients, making your work more interesting. And when I say cinematic, just so you know, I don't mean the word like you hear everybody else using it. It's kind of like a buzzword in our industry now. It's cinematic this, cinematic that, cinematic B-roll, cinematic, like everything's cinematic now. Like if it looks good, if it's high quality, it's cinematic. From my perspective, just because something looks good or just because it's high quality or shot on a cinema camera, for example, doesn't necessarily make it cinematic. See, cinematic has a definition. The definition of cinematic is having characteristics or qualities of the movies, of cinema. It means that it's movie-like. See, movies have this look that draws people in. It's this storytelling. It's this cinematic look that draws you in. You can't pull away. It catches your attention. It's beautiful. And certainly, some of the best cinematographers in the world are making movies. That's not to say that every movie in the world is super cinematic, because certainly there are movies that are not, frankly. Movies are kind of like, I guess, the pinnacle of cinematography. By adapting the quality, the style of work that the best filmmakers in the world are making, and taking that and recreating it with your own work. And that doesn't mean you have to have expensive cameras. It doesn't mean that you have to go all out and have a big studio or a big budget like they do. You can do it on a smaller level, but regardless of what you're doing or what camera you're shooting on or how you're working to make your footage look cinematic is what is going to give you those benefits. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the 5 things that cinematographers do that makes their work look cinematic that, videographers maybe don't. All right, so number 1 is that cinematographers typically shoot on longer lenses. In fact, it's not actually just longer lenses, but they are more intentional about which lenses they shoot on. Whereas videographers will either gravitate towards wide lenses pretty much exclusively or long lenses exclusively. So when I was starting out as a filmmaker, I remember there was this huge craze where everybody was getting the widest lens they could get, not like fisheye, but like a Canon 16 to 35 millimeter lens at 16 millimeters. And they'd go out there with their, full frame cameras, the Canon 5D Mark II, Mark III. It was like all the craze. And they'd go around with their glide cams and shoot this footage of just like wide shots of landscapes or whatever it might be. And it was really popular, and that's what everybody was doing. I kind of got into that as well. I did that a little bit. But after a while, I started to realize that if you watch movies, if you watch high-end commercials, you don't ever see them like running around on a glide cam with a wide lens. You'll rarely ever see that. In fact, you'll see cinematographers using longer lenses more often. And when I say longer lenses, I mean like in standard focal length. So anywhere from like 35 to 50 millimeters on a Super 35 sensor is kind of the sweet spot for most of the stuff. Now, that's not to say that cinematographers don't use other focal lengths. Like they will use really long lenses like an 85 mil or 100 mil, or they will use really wide lenses sometimes, but it's usually just for stylistic effect. So unlike videographers who will just always put an 85 millimeter on because it looks creamy and has nice bokeh and nice shallow depth of field, which are, really secrets to getting a somewhat cinematic look. But what they'll do is they'll take, that lens and shoot everything in slow motion just like that. Cinematographers are more intentional about what lenses they're using because different lenses have different amounts of barrel distortion. They have different amounts of bokeh and that shallow depth of field look. And so those different lenses will give you a different look. It will tell a different story based on what you're telling. So cinematographers are intentional about the lenses they're using and typically are shooting around, that 35 to 50 millimeter focal length, whereas videographers will kind of just stick to one lens because they like the look of that one lens. Number 2 is that cinematographers focus heavily on the story rather than just shooting cinematic B-roll. So when I was starting out, I remember going out with friends. We would just go and shoot footage. We'd take our cameras out. We'd go get shots of the mountains, of trees, of my girlfriend, who's my wife now. We get shots of each other. We would just run around and just shoot stuff. Shoot the dog, shoot, friends, shoot just whatever we could shoot on our cameras. And, that's a really good exercise when you're starting out, to just get familiar with your camera, start to get the hang of it, understand your camera settings, understand what you're doing with it. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But as you grow and as you start to really become a cinematographer, then you really want to focus on telling a story. Just shooting footage of your dog in your backyard is not really doing much for you. And instead of doing that, you want to focus on, well, what story are you trying to tell? How are you bringing in the lighting and the composition and the storytelling elements to craft that story so that you're working more like a cinematographer who tells a story rather than just kind of shooting videography? Number 3 is lighting, lighting, lighting. I cannot make a video about cinematography without talking about lighting. Lighting is the number one skill that you need to develop as a filmmaker if you want to create really cinematic, like truly cinematic work. It really, for the most part, comes down to lighting. So cinematographers focus really heavily on crafting and modifying their light to create really beautiful lighting, whereas videographers typically just use natural light or use what's available. Now, I remember when I was, getting started in making music videos and commercials for brands, like really when I was just starting out. And I remember, lighting scenes because I knew that I had to light scenes. I was supposed to light them, but I didn't really have any concept of where I'm supposed to put the lights or how I'm supposed to put them, what they're supposed to look like on my subject, or even how to modify or craft the light to get the look that I want. So what cinematographers do is, rather than just using natural light or just throwing up lights anywhere, like what I would do is I would just take my lights that I got from a hardware store and I'd throw them behind my talent just because like silhouetting looked cool. And so that was what I did on every single video because I didn't know how to do anything else. So instead of doing that, what cinematographers do is they really focus on crafting the light, looking at what does the light need to look like? How does it look on the subject? Where is it breaking? They're paying attention very closely to where the light is, where it's changing to shadow, what the quality of the light is, the angle of the light, the color of the light, all the different aspects of lighting. They really pay attention to that because that has such a huge effect on not just making your work look really cinematic, which it does, but on telling your story and really crafting an emotion and a mood to your piece. So focusing on lighting is a really huge, important thing. Number 4 is cinematographers put a heavy emphasis on what's in front of the camera, whereas videographers typically just kind of shoot whatever and then slap on editing transitions or, speed ramp effects or whatever to make the mediocre footage look cinematic. So in cinematography, there's this thing called the signal chain that I call the cinematography signal chain. And I actually learned this concept back from when I was working in audio production and music production. In audio, there's a thing called the signal chain, right? And it's how the audio moves from one thing to the next. So for example, you've got a microphone, it captures the audio, that goes through a cable into a preamp, and then from the preamp, it goes into the computer, and then the computer, you put the editing effects on it, and then it goes into the mix, then master, and then the export, right? That is the audio signal chain. And what beginners do is they tend to focus on the end of the signal chain. So they don't use a very good microphone, they don't use a really good preamp, they don't use the best effects on their editing or spend a lot of time on editing. And then what they do is they get to the mixing and the mastering stage, and then they're trying to make everything sound good at that very last final step. What the professionals know is that by focusing on the beginning of the signal chain, you can actually create a ripple effect that makes everything look or sound better down the road. So by having a better sounding microphone, you won't have to do as much work editing or in mixing and mastering. And it even goes further than the microphone, because more important than the microphone is the instrument. So a good guitar is going to sound better than a bad guitar. And even more important than that is the person playing the guitar. For example, a good guitarist on a bad guitar is going to sound better than a bad guitarist on a good guitar. So Everything is important throughout the entire signal chain, but if you focus on the beginning of the signal chain, it creates this ripple effect that makes everything else look better. So if you spend a lot of time on really getting a good guitarist and a good guitar in a good sounding room, then the microphone doesn't matter as much, the editing doesn't matter as much, and when you get to the mixing and mastering stage, you're hardly doing anything. You're just doing little tweaks to get it just right. And this is the same thing for filmmaking and for cinematography. The more you can focus on the beginning of the signal chain, the better everything will look down the road. So rather than just going out and shooting mediocre footage and then throwing effects on it in editing to make it look cinematic, focus on what's happening in front of the camera, okay? The wardrobe, the set design, production design, the location, so important, the lighting, all of those things come together to craft an image in camera that already looks amazing, so that when you get to editing and color grading, you only have to make tiny little tweaks to make it look good, because it already pretty much looks as good as it needs to be. And last but not least, number 5 is using camera settings intentionally. So cinematographers are very intentional about how they do pretty much everything. But camera settings is one of those things that they are very intentional about using. Whereas videographers have a tendency to just choose a camera setting and do that. So for example, just shooting everything in slow motion or at a high frame rate, just because it looks cool and because, you know, slow motion is cool and that's what everybody's doing, right? Being intentional about what settings you're using, when you're using slow motion, when you're not using slow motion, in order to tell the story. So as an example of this, kind of an extreme example, if you guys remember when The Hobbit was shot by Peter Jackson, he actually made the controversial decision to shoot it in 48 frames per second. So most movies are shot in 24 frames per second. He shot it at double that. And, you know, it was controversial. Everybody, you know, some people thought it was cool, some people didn't. And it was kind of a polarizing choice. But what happened is he did that very intentionally. Okay, there was a purpose behind it. He wanted the movie to feel like it was a little bit more realistic, like not like the normal Lord of the Rings movies or most other movies where you're kind of removed from the action, where you can see what's going on, but it feels like this other world. When he shot that film, he chose that frame rate intentionally. Now, whether you like that decision or not, like that's fine, that's up to you, but you can't argue the fact that, you know, he's working more as a cinematographer, or the DP, Andrew Lesney, who was the cinematographer, is working more as a cinematographer because he was using those camera settings intentionally. Another example of this was a commercial that I shot a couple years ago in France. So one of my cinema masters, Elizabeth Mayfis, invited me out to shoot this commercial for her, and she was directing it, and we just had a blast. One of the coolest videos that I've shot out in the wine regions of Bordeaux, France. And we went out there and we were telling the story of an old, more aged man who was going through his wine collection. And as he goes through and he pulls out different bottles, it reminds him of these memories of when he was younger. And so it goes to these flashbacks of him as a child and as a teenager and then growing up and getting married and that whole thing. And so we made the decision to shoot everything at different frame rates in order to tell that story. So when he is in the wine cellar going through the different wine bottles in the present, everything was shot at 30 frames per second and then slowed down to 24 frames per second. So just a very subtle slowed down effect. And if you didn't know, you probably miss it. But it's just barely slowed down a little bit, which kind of shows that he was more advanced in age and that, you know, things were going on like that. And then when it would go to the flashbacks, we would shoot those in 24 frames per second, which made them feel more vibrant and alive, like when he was younger and, just full of life and full of energy. And then at the very end of the video, when his granddaughter comes in and he actually gives her the key to his vineyard, it's like the past coming into the future. We shot that part in 24 frames per second. So if you watch that film, you'll notice that we use the camera settings and the frame rate intentionally to tell the story, rather than just shooting everything in slow motion because slow motion looks cool. All right, so there you go. Hopefully that was helpful. There's 5 things that cinematographers do that videographers maybe don't. And of course, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's at least 5 things that I wanted to share with you. Now, you'll notice going through this list, this might be interesting, that none of the things I talked about had anything to do with the camera gear, the camera or the lights or any of the gear that you're using to get your shots. And that's because cinematography, when it comes down to it, isn't about having an amazing camera or amazing gear. Certainly those things are helpful It's nice to have nice gear. It certainly makes the whole process much easier. And so as you grow and as you get better, you'll want to upgrade to better and better gear. But if you're just starting out, if you're a videographer right now, you're beginning, you're new to this, and you don't have an expensive camera, you don't have expensive lights, you don't have, a big studio or big crew or big budget, that's okay. You can still create amazing cinematic work. And I want to show you exactly how. So down in the description below, I'm going to put a link to a free 1-hour cinematography training where I teach my top 10 cinema hacks, just like kind of what I just talked about in this video, where I'm going to teach you how to create cinematic looking videos using whatever gear you have. Everything I teach focuses on the techniques and the principles and theory of cinematography, because if you can learn that, if you can understand how cinematography works, then it can apply to any camera gear, any lights, whatever you have. And that's really what matters when it comes to creating work that looks truly cinematic. So if you're interested in learning cinematography and becoming more of a cinematographer rather than a videographer, then definitely check out the link down in the description below. It's a free 1-hour training where I go in depth into everything you need to know to create work that looks really cinematic. Anyway, hope you guys enjoy that. Check it out down below, and we will see you on the next video. Bye-bye.